Ready. You guys ready? Can you see that?
It's all you.
All right. Yeah, so thanks for the great introduction, Jenny. So let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about Faker for test data creation. And just to go off that introduction, let me sort of introduce myself as well. So my name is Eric Ayala, and I am a lead QA engineer at When I Work. And when I tell people I work at When I Work, their first impression is like, wait, you do what? You work where and how? But no, it's actually a company that exists in the Midwest, and we do time and attendance for hourly workers. And my focus on there is on Android, iOS, and web automation. And I used to work in a technical support role earlier on in my career, and I found out very quickly that I like to break stuff. And over time, that breaking stuff thing became an idea of, wait a minute, I can actually do this for a living. This is actually part of software development that exists. And that's kind of how I got into quality assurance. So my time in quality assurance started out as more of an analyst role and kind of morphed into what I'm doing right now, which is like automation engineer on 3 different platforms. And as I said in the previous slide, I have a retired racing greyhound named Cosmo. He is 65 pounds of pure non-energy. He spends about 18 hours a day sleeping, and that's his vibe, and that's my vibe. So yeah, we get down. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today in this presentation. First, I want to talk about how we enter data for automated tests, sort of the challenges that we face in doing such. And then I'm going to introduce you to a cool tool called Faker that'll help you create this randomized test data from scratch. After that, I'm going to be conducting a live demo and sort of walk through how it works in a real world scenario and kind of go from there. All right, so entering data for automated tests. How do we do it? Let's talk about the big picture here. Creating useful data for automated testing is hard. If anyone has ever worked with a big Excel spreadsheet or a text file, we know that maintaining this test data can be time consuming. Here I just have a whole bunch of different pictures of randomized sample data. And imagine going through this every single time you want to run an automated test and having to update things, switch things out, and sort of perform maintenance on this huge set of data every time you want to run your automated tests. Now, with that being said, developing a data game plan can be tricky. When we set up our tests, we want to make sure the data is clean. When we tear them down, we want to make sure that data is out of the system. Whether that mean being wiped from the database, we run an API call to clear all the data. That could be a talk in and of itself. So what are some ways that we enter data for our automated tests? One of the most common ways is doing hard coding. So for Selenium, this would be involved with like send keys, it'd be a static value. Cypress, I believe you'd use type to enter it in. And if it's a manual test case, you would enter like John Smith for the particular field, sort of like a hard coding value. Now, there are other ways to enter data as well. Aforementioned text files, CSVs, and JSONs. Now, in my old company, we used to import all of our user data from a YAML. And every time we had to run a test, we had to make sure that data was valid. And that became very tricky, very time consuming. So speaking of tricky and time consuming, let's talk about the challenges presented with these different ways of entering information. Now, the first issue was entering unique information. So some applications require unique information on every single run. So the aforementioned John Smith, if I already have that user in the system, if I enter John Smith again, I might get a validation error of this user already exists. And if we have these static values where we really don't change the data with the for automated tests, we might not find certain errors in our tests. For example, data validation. So we have here to the right a picture of a full name. I only have the first name, and it's going to have invalid full name because it's expecting a last name. There's also errors with field data type collection. So zip codes, cell phones. Zip codes are formatted certain ways. Cell phones are formatted certain ways in different areas. And speaking of that, localization issues. So to the right here, I have my random Raleigh number, and we see here it's coming up with the localization error that it's not valid in France. And we'll talk about validation and localization in the upcoming lab demo. So let's talk about maintenance. Now, if you're like my company, we have thousands of end-to-end tests, and dealing with all this mass amount of data can be really time consuming. When these tests run in parallel and they pull from the same source, like say that YAML I mentioned earlier, making sure everything is up to date is super time consuming. And on top of that, we want to consider the teardown strategies. So essentially, when we run a test and everything is finished up, how is that data still in the system? Is it still in the database as far as like tests running on top of each other? It can really cause a lot of different issues. Now let me talk about a cool tool that I've been using at one I work called Faker. So Faker is a library that generates random data for each test run. Now this can be used to create user data as far as credit cards, passwords, a wide variety of other types of randomly generated information. Faker is available in all sorts of different languages, including Python, Ruby, which is what I'll be doing my live demo in, JavaScript, PHP, Java, and Pro. I think it's available for C#, but I kind of like ran out of room on this particular slide, so I'm like, I'll just go 6. So how I use Faker. In my organization, I use Faker for dynamic data generation for signups, inputting in various text fields, and for different localizations, which I'll demonstrate in the live demo. I use this on all 3 platforms I test on. So iOS testing, Android testing, and all sorts of web-based testing. So this tool is pretty dynamic in its application, not only on the front end, but the back end as well. Now let's talk about the data generation tools that Faker has available for you. I mentioned user data, but let's go over some of the other stuff that you can use to generate fake data. Oops. So here's just a README. And here is all the data generators you have available. So it seems like, well, what is all this stuff? But let's just click on Chuck Norris. If you call Chuck Norris and then append fact, and this is a Ruby library, by the way, it'll come back with a random Chuck Norris fact, which is pretty awesome. It's like way cooler than lorem ipsum. But you can use actually lorem ipsum if you wanted to. It's here somewhere. But let's talk about stuff that could be more useful. So this one is the internet one, email, usernames, passwords, IP addresses, MAC addresses. All this stuff can be spoofed for your particular test. And I won't go through everything, but as you can see, there's just a ton of different things that you can use to spoof fake data. All right, localization. This part is super important if you're testing apps that are available in different countries. So for me, I'm a primarily English speaker. When I test stuff, I don't really know any good examples of, let's say, if I'm working with Japanese, like it's going to create kanji characters, and I don't really know what a good address would be in Japan. I don't really know what good cities and first names and how that would be translated into kanji or hiragana or katakana. But thankfully, Faker allows you to use these different localizations. And let's just go through that real quick. So every single one of these YAMLs is a different localization. So we have German, all different types of flavors of English, Spanish, French, Japanese, Russian, etc., etc. And basically what you do is you set the config ahead of time, which I'll demonstrate in my live demo. And that basically allows you to pass in these values, translate into these particular localizations. And yeah, hipster, awesome. So let's talk about the live demo portion. This is the part I'm really excited about. I kind of want to walk through how Faker can be used in a real world setting and yeah, sort of go from there and see how it works. So I created a little project for this presentation, and it's basically, I won't go into it in much detail, but basically I have Cucumber to do my behavior-driven development stuff. I have Water, which is like a Selenium wrapper that's going to drive the browser. I have assertions, page object models, all that good fun stuff. But I don't want to get too deep into that. Most of that stuff can be a talk in and of itself. So let's just keep it sort of high level and talk about what these tests will do and how Faker can be incorporated into these tests. Take a sip of water real quick. So let's talk about the first scenario here at the top. Now, this goes to a website called the internet. So there are a few different websites that are out there that you can use to test your automation on. So if you're goofing around and you want to play with different frameworks and stuff, there is this site called the internet, which has all sorts of different context menus and things you can play with in regards to automation. Super cool. It's been out for a while, and I'm going to use this for the forgot password field. Pretty simple. User enters a password. User enters an example, hits retrieve password, and your email's been sent. Easy peasy. Now let's just run this automated, and it's going to launch your browser and go through this super quick, but I'll slow it down afterwards. Let's run this scenario. It's going to finish in like maybe 5 seconds. Launches the browser, boom, done. 3 seconds, sorry, even shorter. So I have a breakpoint in here. So let's kind of walk through it and see how Faker is used to generate that email with random data. So let's run the debugger. It's going to launch. And let me do some resizing so y'all can see both the site and my console. So here we see the code here. I'm basically passing in this email field from the page object, and it generated francis@olsenanderson.co. Just totally random, totally generated via Faker. So what I'm going to do is, let's delete this. Oops. Okay, that clears that guy out. And I'm just going to copy this. Then hit enter. Boom, you got a fresh, brand new, randomly generated email. So jude@wildren.info, whatever that is. Let's do it again, just for fun. Clear it out. Boom, you got a new email. Now, I can also show you a few different types of things that you can use for email. Here's safe email, and that generates an email appended with example.net. So in the like super slim case that this would go out to a real person, this would negate that. Clear that guy out. What else we got? Free email. So this is your Yahoo's, your Hotmails, your Gmail. It's going to generate these particular email types for your tests. Pretty neat, pretty simple, pretty cool. Stop this fella. Let's take a look at the second one I got. Now this one's a little bit more involved. This one's going to go to a second site that's used for automation practice called automationpractice.com. So let's check this guy out. Let's go to the main page. So yeah, this is one of many sites that you can use to practice your automated framework on. And I'm going to use this one for the purposes of a user sign up. So let's just walk through this manually real quick. So pretty straightforward. User creates an account. Let's do like test@example.com. Doesn't exist. Cool. And this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. Anyone who's done any kind of sign up, which I'm sure you guys have done a million of these, you're going to be familiar with something like this. First name, last name, email, password, date of birth, sign up for newsletter. I mean, I'm not going to do that in my test because no one likes spam, you know. Company, I do something a little bit fun with this. I'll get to that in 1 second. Addresses, city, state, postal code, country, additional info. I also do something fun with this too. We'll get to that in 1 second. And then phone numbers. So let's run this test. And basically what this is going to do is Faker is going to fill out almost all of these values in this particular sign up process and then submit. So it's all going to be randomly generated. Let's just go through this real quick. Going to run this guy. Take a drink of water. Boom, 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 registered. And within 10 seconds, you have a fully registered user with completely randomized data. So let's check this out and see how it works under the hood. I got my breakpoint in. So it's going to do the first part. I'm going to go through all this once more. And let me resize my browser here. I'm not going to go through every single one of these because it'd be super time consuming, but let's check out what I have for the steps and what appears on the screen. So first name, last name, that's generated via Faker. I'm using a neutral first name. Email, which was covered in the previous. Password, pretty straightforward. Let's move this over a little bit. Date of birth. This is a little bit different. I had to do this outside of Faker. Basically, I took all the values within these drop downs, put them into an array, and selected them at random. So it's not really a Faker thing, but it just selects them all randomly. I don't click any of these radio buttons. Like I said, dude, no one likes spam. You know what I'm saying? And then go down to company. Here's something I did a little bit fun with. So I'm a big fish fan. You can't see it, but in the next room I have this huge fish poster. So one of the things you could do with Faker is generate a random value with a fish song, and then I just append ink to the string. So this is like split open and melt ink, which is a fish song, which is really silly, but I thought it was funny. So we got the address, street address, secondary address, city, state's another drop down thing, cell phone, we see it's generated here. Zip code, I actually found a bug in this site because Faker formats all different types of zip codes, and it was thrown an error that anything outside of the regular 5-digit zip was not valid. So I just set it to NC just so I could pass this test for informational purposes. But yeah, that's a great example of using randomized data to find bugs that you wouldn't really find otherwise if you just use static values. So additional information. Right here, I'm passing in a string from my favorite movie ever, Back to the Future. You want a Pepsi, pal? You gotta pay for it. 1955. Phone numbers, pretty straightforward. Let's see if this works. Boom. So I got this Emerson person. They have all their information here. The test does some assertions to look for the user and all that stuff. That's a whole other thing. But yeah, I just wanted to show you how kind of works under the hood, sending all these values. It's all randomized. So let's stop this guy. Now, another thing I mentioned during my slides is localization. So basically what I have here is I set the config for Faker ahead of time to Japanese, put it in a hook before the test runs, tag it, and then when I use that tag, well, not the entire set of values, but most of the values will be in Japanese in some capacity. So all I really have to do is uncomment that. Let me see, I have my Japanese locale in my before hook. Debug once more. And like I said, not all the values are going to be in kanji, but we'll get some good stuff that I would not have seen previously. Oops. Wait, I think I messed this up. Let's do this again. Okay. Live demos, y'all. All right, so last name. We see that we got kanji for that value. So basically just passing in that config allows you to have Japanese values for your tests. Also, the city is in kanji, the address, which is formatted to the specific of Japan. And day on late for school from Back to the Future, because Back to the Future is awesome. So yeah, basically just to give you a high level of how some of these tests can help you generate data you might not even be familiar with as far as localization is concerned. Just makes life a little bit easier. Let's close this guy out. Sum my test. Now we talked about how Faker can be used to help on the front end. Let's talk a little bit about how it can be used on the back end too. So I just created this little script here. Basically what it does is pushes a bunch of hashes to an array and converts that into a JSON. But all the values are generated via Faker. So we got first name, last name, street address, city, state, cell, social security number. And when I run this, it's going to output this into a nicely formatted JSON. So let's just do this real quick. It's going to create this reports folder here. Click on the JSON. So here we have 20 different users created from nothing. Basically, I just clicked the play button and we got 20 new users. First name, last name, street address, go all the way down. These are all randomized. Click it again. And we got 20 fresh, brand new users generated completely with Faker data. So pretty cool application on the front end, but also a cool application on the back end as well. Neat stuff. So let me maximize this. And that kind of concludes the live demo portion. And yeah, so just to bring things to a close, we learned about entering data for automated tests, the challenges presented there within, and how Faker can be a great tool to leverage for automated data generation. I hope that you can use this tool for your automated test and take your stuff to the next level and help develop a data game plan for your organization. And most of all, if this helps make your life just slightly easier in automation, then this presentation did its job. Questions?
Thanks, Eric. That's awesome. I am already thinking of the ways I'm going to be using this. There are a couple questions that have been posted to chat. David, you want to speak up and ask?
Yeah. Actually, I had a bunch, but I'll just ask the first one. Your emails that are being used or generated, I guess, out of the test were clearly fake, but could they be mapped to real ones or a single real one so that you always got a response and could validate that you were in fact getting a response?
Yeah, so I think all the ones are in general are supposed to be generated to like fake data. So everything is randomized. But if you implemented something on your end like MailChimp, or excuse me, not MailChimp, basically a way to capture emails. We use MailHog, that's what I'm thinking of. We use MailHog to capture all of our outgoing emails. So if you generate an email via Faker and you send it out to whatever server that MailHog is on and within your organization, that would be a way to sort of verify that information.
Cool, thanks.
So Sue's asking if there are random Japanese values or are they selected from a list of valid names in Hiragana, for example?
Yeah, so if you go in the Ruby library for Faker, each particular language will have a YAML of all the different types of stuff that's randomized. So we saw there it was like last name and like city and address. Everything for city and address is randomized, last names are randomized, but it'll only be applicable to those particular fields within that YAML. So if you want a wider picture of what's supported as far as like the local languages are concerned, you can check out that YAML and their GitHub to give you a bigger picture of what it supports.
Do you get to choose the size as well? Like if you wanted to make a really, really huge name, will it generate a really large fake name?
That's a good question. I haven't tried that yet. There are some of the methods that you can pass in where if you set parameters, like we saw, I had password, it was like a 5-digit minimum. Fields like that, you can extend well beyond 5 digits, but I'm not sure if it's applicable to all fields. I would have to check it out.
You could always just put Back to the Future quotes for the last name.
Dude, yeah, like there are so many different strings that you could generate, and some of them are just massive. So if you want like a massive name that's randomly generated, pick one from the data generation that you think is super cool, like I did for fish, and that might set you straight.
If the word is really big or the phrase is really big in Japanese and they drop the last character or whatever, it changes the meaning.
That sounds like German, where you don't know what people are talking about until the sentence is finished.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the other half of the test is you randomly generate this, but you also have to intelligently know what to expect. Expect it to only be limited to 20 characters and expect it to drop off the end or don't expect it to drop.
So the next question is, where did the music library come from? Also, faker.com is a not safe for work. This is a great caution. Thank you, Alan, for this advice. I have on occasion been to a site that I was like, oh, where am I going? Yeah, so don't go to faker.com. It's not an automated test library. But where did you find the music library?
That one is in the list of the data generators that I pulled up previously. There's one that does like a high level one just for music. I think it would like, it'll grab some band names if you pass in like faker.music and then bands. And Fish has one all by itself, which is super cool. So I'm like, dude, I gotta use that one.
All right, Hamid. Thank you for being here. Hamid, he asked, can you multiply the number of records created in the backend test without manually typing each instance?
Yeah, so that script I used, I just did a loop that would create 20 users at once. If I wanted to create like 3,000, I would just, for my particular script, I would just increase the loop size and generate like 3,000 users at once.
Cool. All right, and John, is Faker, go ahead.
Yep, the same thing, got it.
Cool. All right, so John's question is Faker typically used in the test itself, or is it intended to create data which is used by the test code?
For my application, what I use it on Android, iOS, and web, I use it to work in the test itself. So like basically front end stuff. So I thought sign up was a great example because I use it for sign up all the time. We have to use Google Places library, and there's certain fields that have to be quote unquote real in some capacity. So I use it there. And the backend stuff I showed you with that JSON, that was just sort of like a little fun thing I put together as a, how this can be used outside of the front end. But for my purposes at work, it's mostly front end stuff.
We've actually used it or something similar for creating data for the back end on some projects. And it's been just absolutely incredible because no one wants to have to think of 13 first names.
And user 1, user 2, user 3, user 4 only gets you so far.
Right?
Yeah, no, this is definitely more interesting. Are there any more questions for Eric tonight?
Looks like David had another.
Is there a method for generating? Go ahead, David.
All right, I've done this in the past, but it took a while to script it, but trying to generate a large number of sequential data that are within a valid range, like IP addresses or MAC addresses.
So as far as sequential is concerned, I don't think it'll do sequential like one after the other. But if you wanted to pass in a randomized MAC or an IP address under the data generator for internet on the Ruby library, it has support for IP4, IP6, stuff like that, MAC addresses. So yeah, you can definitely pass that stuff in.
Well, to me, it was the difference between trying to do a UI test versus, I think like what Jenny mentioned was a really large data set for performance or stress testing or something. Does it provide that capability to do lots of data?
That's a good question. Like if I ran that script, like I said, a couple hundred times, and I had values for like a MAC address or an IP address, would that sort of be applicable to that use case? So I create like 3,000 users and they all had their own IP addresses.
Yeah, I'm thinking 300,000 or 3 million, but yeah, it might work.
And yeah, that would be quite a stress test for sure.
Of their product or mine?
I mean, why not both?
Does that answer your question, David? Cool. All right, so Leo's asking, I'm sorry, I'm terrible at reading in the night. Do you ever run into situations like the system under test would reject a value like social security number because it knows it's not conforming to the social security number pattern? Visa cards have the embedded pattern. Some driver's licenses also do that, where it's like, I expect you to follow a pattern.
Yes, for things that expect a certain pattern, like credit cards. I've tested credit cards a few times, and like there's test values for, I believe, Stripe and a couple other ones that you can use. That's kind of outside the realm of the random generator. If it expects a value that's super specific, like a social security pattern, that's really involving the application itself. So if you need like a quote unquote real credit card number, you can use Stripe or whatever the test stuff they have for that. If you need a social security number, that would really be dependent on the app itself that you're testing. Can you throw in like completely false data and will it accept it, which is a good use case.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Does that answer your question, Leo? Cool. All right, so Tom's asking, what about a hybrid solution? Is it possible to use both Faker data as well as a CSV that is not random? So you can specify what your values are. I think he's both asking the question, but also proposing an idea for you.
I mean, I think that you could. So let's say you passed in user values from a CSV in one test. I would personally write a separate scenario that would do the Faker stuff and apply that randomly generated information. So if you have scenario A pulls in from the CSV, scenario B pulls in from Faker, it may not be the same test at the same time, although you might be able to do that. But that would how, just like spitballing how I would do it off the top of my head. Yeah, first test, CSV, second test, Faker.
Got it. All right, so how would you compare this to fuzz testing? Is that what Faker is designed to do?
So refresh my memory, what's fuzz testing?
Yeah, John, I don't know that I've heard about fuzz testing.
Well, I can't say that I really know that much myself, but it's basically just throwing a lot of random data. I've heard about it in the context of security or penetration testing, where you try to find some vulnerability. Hey, I hit it with this random value, and it made the it completely opened me up into root.
So if you upload a book to someone's password field and see what happens.
Yeah, I think it sort of starts to point to the application under test and what you're trying to get out of it. Faker might be good for something where, I'm going to let you answer, Eric, too, but this is what I'm thinking you're getting to. If you're trying to do pen testing, that's one thing. But if you're verifying that these fields only allow you to pick reasonable constraints, that's a different thing.
Yeah, for me, I'd be like, yo, drop table, enter this, see what it does.
Yeah, and that might not be automated testing. Cheryl's given us a great definition. It's a technique used to discover coding errors and security loopholes in software, operating systems, or network. It involves putting in massive amounts of random data to test subject in an attempt to make it crash.
Nice. I wonder if you could capture a whole bunch of those strings at once and then try to like enter them into a field automatically and see what would happen.
Yeah, and Faker has libraries for books. So, I mean,
that's a good
upload a book.
Yeah, that's a good starting point.
All right, well, let's move on to the next question. As someone who used to do these by hand, can I feed a base name to be randomized? So like, this name is too long, XXXXX, and this name is too short.
So are you trying to basically do string concatenation, or?
So back in the day when I used to do all of this by hand, which you showed us Faker can miraculously do, I would creatively have in the name what I expected the outcome to be. I expect this test to fail because blah, blah, 001, 002, 003. And I expect this test to pass because 001, 002, 003. And I was wondering if you could pass any base names into the randomizer that would randomize around it. Like, it would still have that base name, but have some random characters either, following it or preceding it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the live demo portion, I appended my fish song and then .inc, or excuse me, I appended space and then inc to basically generate a fake company name. So that would be an example of like taking a string from Faker and then appending it with whatever consistent type string that you want. And you put them all together. And then I say if you wanted to do an assertion on that, you take Faker, you take the string that you append, store it in a local variable, and then once it's you go to the next step, do an assertion and see if it shows up on the page, if that's the sort of test that you want.
Just a brief clarification. Faker's a tool, it's a library that has its own libraries. I'm a little, how would you get started with using Faker in your language of choice? You would look for a library called Faker.
Yeah, so for Ruby, it's a Ruby gem, and for other languages, you'd call it like a library, and I'm not super familiar with all of them I listed, but in some capacity, it's a library that you want to call. So in my Ruby test, I declare at the beginning of the Ruby file to require faker. So that basically instantiates it. And then I could run it. I could call all those values within a particular test. Now, as far as installing is concerned on the Ruby end, it's a Ruby gem. So basically gem install faker, and then you're basically good to go in that regard. And it's different from Python and so on and so forth.
Right, that's beautiful. So it's basically a library that you look for in your language of choice then.
Yep, third-party library, and hopefully it makes life a little bit easier.
Yeah, and then that script that you demonstrated at the end, that was a script that you put together leveraging the Faker library that just generated all this data for you, and however you output it into a file or whatever, that's going to be an input to a test.
Yeah, so for that one, I basically instantiate Faker and a different gem for JSON, or maybe it's part of the Ruby library, I forget. But yeah, called both of those, and then have my script run so I can use both, converting it to JSON and stuff I did for Faker to put those hash values into that array.
Cool. Could you show that slide again that showed all the ones that you could think of that have Faker? I realize there's more than are on that slide.
Sure. Do you want the data generation slide? Is that the one?
The one that showed all the, Faker is available in these languages.
Oh, yeah. Let's go back to that. Give me 1 second here.
Also, dropped a helpful comment with the NPM for Baker in the comments to check that.
All right, so let me share my screen real quick. All right, can y'all see that? Well, yeah, so yeah, Ruby Gem is what I went with for the live demo portion.
That helps you?
Did you have a list of the file types that it supported?
Thank you, yes.
Sorry, I caught a little bit of that. What was that?
The file types that it supports. You mentioned JSON and it was like XML part of that. And
yeah, so yeah, you can output this stuff to a JSON, a CSV, a text file, etc. But the thing that I demonstrated was like just a script I put together to throw it in a JSON. But I'm sure there's ways to put it in a CSV as well. I really haven't looked into that part.
It just really comes down to like file output on your script, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Does Faker allow you to include or exclude duplicates, right? Because eventually, you have 300,000, you're going to run across a duplicate maybe. Random is only so random.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never actually got to the point where it's such an enormous amount of data that stepped on each other. So I'm sure it's a possibility, but thus far, it's, at least on my end, it's been okay with not stepping on each other. So
I mean, there are only so many fish songs, right?
I know, man. Yeah,
It's
but they're all
story, but it is,
yeah.
We are limited. There is a finite number.
But like some are like 20 minutes long, so it's like 4 songs in one.
have to go to their solo albums or something.
Awesome. It looks like our questions have slowed down in chat. Eric, I really appreciate you coming over here today, taking the time with us. This has been really useful and helpful, and I hope that you guys will be able to take this away, use it in your day-to-day practice, or just stuff it in your back pocket for when it does come up, you need it.